I was on the hunt for the route of the Exodus, searching for the sea that Moses and the Israelites crossed after leaving Egypt. This sea was said to have miraculously parted, making a way for the Israelites to cross, and yet destroying Pharaoh and his army. The mystery of where this event took place has captivated people for thousands of years. Can I now verify its true location? The way I was drawn into this investigation goes back to 2001. I heard reports that Exodus explorers diving in the Red Sea were making exciting discoveries of Pharaoh's army on the sea floor. That's what first brought me to Egypt. These divers claimed to have found chariot wheels encrusted in coral, along with skeletons. It was so intriguing and very controversial. But over time, I began to realize there was more involved here. Because where you place the sea crossing determines the size of the miracle needed. And it's the nature of this miracle that now grips me. Not just where it happened, but how it happened. I discovered that there are two main approaches that explain this miracle very differently. And there are people of faith in both camps. I traveled to the wilderness of southern Israel to meet with Australian Deborah Hearn. For Hearn, it all began in 1995 while on a family vacation to the Holy Land. She was introduced to the debate over the true location of Mount Sinai. She would become captivated with solving the mystery of the Israelites' journey in the wilderness and invest over 12 years of her life to research the subject. This culminated in her doctoral thesis on the route of the Exodus. For a long time, the idea was that the Israelites crossed down through here and crossed the Suez.
Yeah.
If you look at maps,
Yeah.
that are 300-400 years old, that this was a common understanding and that they went off into this mountain down here.
I was raised on that view that they actually basically crossed through about 10 kilometres south of Suez, but it's still very deep. The wind can't do it. There's no way the wind can do it. You have to rely then on a spectacular miracle. Why mention the wind?
Hearn brought up an important factor. One reason the Egyptian approach sees the sea crossing happening through a shallow body of water is because the Bible mentions the work of the wind.
And the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided.
Hearn takes the Egyptian approach, seeing the events happening on a small scale, with shorter travel to a sea crossing at one of the shallow lakes near Egypt. Why do you think that scholars started to shift away from the Suez and move the thinking further north to a more of a marshy lake?
The shift from a spectacular Suez crossing happened because the scholars became uncomfortable with the supernatural, with the patently supernatural, and they were looking for a more natural explanation.
Do you think it was a larger miracle, or do you think it was a smaller miracle?
The text indicates it was very large.
Jodelle Onstadt was an agnostic that went on a 16-year personal journey looking for evidence of the Bible. Her search for answers led her into archaeology, history, and biblical research. She found the proof for God that she was looking for and wrote the nearly 1,200-page treatise, Yahweh Exists. Onstadt takes a Hebrew approach, which sees the events of the Exodus on a much larger scale, including the miracles, with the sea crossing at the distant and deep Gulf of Aqaba.
The one thing that separates Israel's God from all the other deities over the course of the history is this idea of the parting of the Red Sea, this huge miracle. And it is referred to, I believe, over 20 times throughout the Hebrew text as being the defining moment of bringing Israel and making them a nation.
Talking with Deb Hearn and Jodel Onstad, I could understand how their view of miracles impacts where they place the sea crossing. The Egyptian approach favors naturalistic explanations, meaning that God used something in nature to cause the miracle to happen, while the Hebrew approach sees miracles as spectacular events beyond natural explanation. I just want to know which of these views best matches the biblical account, because understanding the nature of miracles might be the clue to solving this mystery. Oxford professor C.S. Lewis had an aversion to God and miracles as a young atheist in the university. He would later change his mind and become one of the most influential voices for Christianity in the 20th century. He and his good friend, fellow Oxford professor J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, would often talk about the deep ideas in the fantasy worlds they created and their connection to our own.
You see, Tollers, our fantasies must show that there is something quite outside this world of ours, especially in this age of machines and artificial environments which we have made for ourselves. Goodness gracious, it's becoming hard enough to gain glimpses of the natural world, let alone the supernatural one to which it points.
Absolutely, Jack. True magic is the power to do good.
I am convinced that miracles are a retelling in small letters of that very same story that is written across the world in letters too large for some to see.
Personally, I had always thought of these miracles as spectacular events. But I wanted to better understand how the Egyptian approach views God working through natural causes. So I traveled to England to meet Sir Cullen Humphreys, who wrote The Miracles of Exodus. He's a highly awarded physicist working in the field of material science and the director of research at the University of Cambridge. In 2010, Humphreys was knighted by the Queen of England for his service to science. As a Christian, he sees no conflict between science and his faith. So what do we have here?
So here we have, this is the latest machine in the world. It's first in the world to grow LEDs and other transistors and so on. In the future, we want to have micro LEDs, which can actually stimulate individual neurons in the brain so we can understand how the brain works. Then we may have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, you know, so really important.
Yeah. While Humphreys views the miracles of Exodus as naturalistic, he also thinks that the sea crossing was far from Egypt at the Gulf of Aqaba, consistent with the Hebrew approach. So he has a hybrid approach, combining aspects of the two views. Why did you become interested in that particular story of the Exodus?
The first thing which struck me was the characteristics of Mount Sinai described in the Bible match the characteristics of a volcano exactly. I mean, it's just a superb observation of an erupting volcano that was being described.
Mm-hmm. Professor Humphreys' view of Mount Sinai as an erupting volcano helped me to understand how many in the Egyptian view see all the miracles of Exodus. From the plagues to the parting of the sea and even the pillar of cloud and fire the Israelites were following. For them, everything had natural causes.
On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder.
So there's a fire and a smoke, which is the obvious characteristic of a volcano, but there's other characteristics as well. So it talks about lightning on the top of the volcano. And you get this with many volcanoes because the ash which is fired up is charged. And so you then get a discharge, as with clouds, and so you get lightning flashes. And then the whole mountain trembled, the Bible says. And you usually get earthquakes preceding and during volcanoes.
Humphreys believes that Mount Sinai was in northwest Saudi Arabia. This area contained the ancient land of Midian, where Moses spent 40 years, and has volcanic activity unlike the Sinai Peninsula.
And there's a particular clue which I thought was just remarkable, and that is the sound of a trumpet came from the mountain. And I found a Roman historian called Dio Cassius. He was describing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 in Italy, and he said the sound of a trumpet was heard coming from Vesuvius. And I thought, how remarkable, and what does it mean? And there's a good scientific explanation, and that is, in a volcanic eruption, hot gases are forced up, and they go through narrow cracks in the rocks, and musical notes come out. It's like blowing a trumpet.
Like
Wonderful.
that? Yeah.
That's right, yes.
I didn't know if I could do that,
That's
but I did.
brilliant,
Yeah.
brilliant. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've received pushback from some Christians because of your naturalistic ideas. How would you respond to that?
I say they're definitely miracles. So the fact we've explained them by science doesn't mean we've explained them away. They're still miracles. They're miracles in the timing.
This sounds intriguing, but does a naturalistic approach at times downplay what the Bible describes for these miracles? Over the last few centuries, the belief has grown that only what can be directly observed and measured should be considered valid. In the 1700s, famous Scottish philosopher David Hume challenged the credibility of miracles. Within a century, the ideas of Hume helped create a new naturalistic mindset among many scholars that would end up shaping the thinking of the modern world and challenge confidence in the miracles of the Bible. Dr. Craig White is a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder. I wanted to talk to him about Hume to understand this shift towards a naturalistic view that's uncomfortable with spectacular miracles. So what are some of the ideas that Hume has developed?
Well, Hume is one of the British empiricists. They really said the most important thing is evidence that we can pile up.
You mean things that you can touch or things you can see?
Right. So you can touch them, you can see them. If you've got evidence, maybe it should be certified in some way.
So Hume didn't believe in miracles.
Right. There's a famous argument he makes. If you're going to believe a story about something that happens in the world, some factual story, you need evidence. And a miracle, by definition, goes against the way things usually are. In his phrase, it violates the laws of nature.
I've heard that.
So if somebody's dead and they rise up 3 days later, they violated the laws of nature.
If waters are parted at a sea?
That's right. If the waters part and stay away, stay apart, so that people can walk through on dry land, that's a violation.
So Hume would have an issue with that.
A big
and
well,
a lot of other
Hume
people.
doesn't say it's impossible. He says, should I believe it or not?
Hume's ideas spread, challenging the validity of biblical miracles in the minds of modern thinkers. But have his ideas also tempered the way many believers think about miracles? Do you think that there are such things as miracles that are actually supernatural, not just naturalistic?
Do you mean spectacular supernatural?
Well, for example, the pillar of fire and the cloud. So was there a pillar of fire and a cloud? The Bible says that they were led through the wilderness by this pillar of fire and
It's only like a year ago that I read an article that said that this is not unusual for Bedouin companies to navigate their way through the desert. They have a wagon and they burn bitumen in heavy clay pots. And during the day, it sends off smoke, and during the night, it sends off light.
And what is the bitumen? Is it a...
Asphalty stuff. It's tar. It burns hot and it burns slow. It was one of the primary products of the Dead Sea area. Now, I'm a conservative Bible believer, and I do believe the angel was with them, and I do believe that God was with them, and I believe that everything that happened to them was orchestrated and created by God. But I am open to the idea that God uses natural and otherwise explicable things to help us, to guide us, to support us, to protect us, to save us. And a wagon with a burning bitumen signal, I'm okay with that, but I'm conflicted. It sounds familiar, and I think,
Moses also recorded that at times the pillar of cloud would descend to the entrance of the tent of meeting. This doesn't sound like a natural phenomenon. I believe that God can and does work through natural means. But the question is, did God only work through normal natural processes in the Exodus? Or were these miracles spectacular in a way that can only be explained by the power of God? Was there a pillar of fire leading the Israelites?
I don't see how you can get around it.
So what you're suggesting is that it wasn't a natural occurrence.
No, the text states that it was a malak. Today we would say that's an angel. The Hebrew says it's God's messenger. And God specifically says, obey his voice. He will not forgive your sins. My name is in him.
Don't you think the whole story is filled with these unusual things?
You have a very theophoric element to this whole wilderness sojourn.
And theophoric means?
God-influenced, God-centric, where today we have this habit of really humanizing God. We don't like the ideas of anything out of the ordinary. We do not see things out of the ordinary occurring. So when we hear about waters parting, Israel walking on dry land, a cloud or a pillar, we're very uncomfortable with those things.
Eric Metaxas is a writer, speaker, and the host of the Eric Metaxas Show. I've known Eric for a number of years. He is also the author of Miracles and numerous other New York Times bestsellers.
I think it's important for us to understand that miracles are for our benefit. God could do everything in a way that looks naturalistic, but there are times when he wants to get our attention. He wants to say, hey, I'm here. I want you to know that I'm here. So that's actually important, that miracles are a way that God communicates to us. And so when people say, well, it's no big deal, if your attitude is it's no big deal, then clearly it's not a miracle. A miracle is meant by God to be a big deal.
Dr. Jason DeRushi takes the Hebrew approach. The Bible talks about a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire that led the Israelites out of Egypt and onto Mount Sinai and was with them through the time in the wilderness. What do you think that was?
Throughout Scripture, miracles of a grand nature like this were not happening all the time. There's just specific moments in history where God is manifesting himself in this way. I think that Israel is experiencing a cloud, but it's more than that. The language of hovering that occurs in Deuteronomy 32 to describe what it was that pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud were doing, it was as if they were hovering like a bird over Israel, leading them. And Israel's call was to wait and to follow. The only other place that language shows up in the Torah is in Genesis chapter 1 of the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. There seems to be a connection here between the cloud and the Spirit.
So what you're suggesting then is that the Spirit of God was using this cloud as a way for them to see God leading them out of Egypt?
It's not just that he was using the cloud, it was that his presence was creating the cloud.
But what sea was this pillar leading them to? In my previous film, I had taken a close look at the biblical account to identify a sequence of 6 steps for the Exodus journey. In the Egyptian approach, the journey to the sea took days, but in the Hebrew approach, it took weeks. In part 1, I investigated the departure, direction, and desert steps for each approach. I had gotten as far as the detour to a dead end in the Egyptian approach. It suggests the detour was caused by forts and canals that ultimately trapped the Israelites at one of the lakes along the border of Egypt's Nile Delta. Now I need to investigate the Hebrew approach for the detour to a dead end.
The Bible records that Moses and the Israelites journeyed out of Egypt until God tells them to turn and camp by the sea. The Lord said to Moses, "Encamp in front of Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdal and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea."
To rightfully locate the sea crossing site, one would have to find these 4 identifying places listed in the biblical account for the dead end. Pi-Hahiroth, meaning mouth of the canal or mouth of the gorge. Migdal, meaning tower or fortress. Yam Suf, the Hebrew name for the sea that was crossed. And Baal-Zephon, meaning Lord of the North, likely a place of worship for the god Baal. Egyptologist David Rohl takes the Egyptian approach, which sees clear links between the biblical terms and locations near Egypt.
It's a perfect fit, so you have all the toponyms in this region.
So you have toponyms that match the biblical text.
They almost triangulate the location.
And you don't think that it was possible then that there was a crossing either at the Suez or over at Aqaba?
I can't see it. As far as I'm concerned, they're just too deep, too difficult, and they're nowhere near where all these toponyms are.
In contrast, those in the Hebrew approach, such as geographer Glenn Fritz, note that the Hebrew name for the sea that was crossed, Yam Suf, was used for the Gulf of Aqaba.
The book of 1 Kings records that King Solomon built a fleet of ocean-going vessels at a place called Etzion Geber, here at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Bible names this sea Yam Suf, the same sea it says the Israelites crossed to escape the Egyptians.
And Fritz notes that it makes no sense for King Solomon to have sea-going vessels trapped in the lakes of Egypt. Besides the place names, the Hebrew approach also believes that the descriptions of the events given by Moses are important clues pointing to the Gulf of Aqaba. Here, there are 3 dead-end locations proposed. The northern tip is where Professor Humphreys believes the Israelites were trapped. In ancient times, this area had marsh flats with reeds that have since been largely covered up by the modern city of Eilat.
You can see that was a very good site for them to be trapped because Pharaoh's army were pursuing them, and what we know is that to get down to the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, you had to go through quite a steep mountain drop, as it were, and it is known from Egyptian records that there was a bypass that chariots could take. When they didn't go down that drop, they actually went up north and then came down again. And so you can imagine the Egyptian army dividing and the foot soldiers chase the Israelites and they'd be behind them. But then the chariots, they'd be in front of them. So they were surrounded. Their only means of escape was crossing this body of water.
His proposal for a shallow water crossing caused by the wind is similar to the scenario at the border lakes of Egypt.
And so if you have a strong wind blowing across a body of water, it forces it back, which then exposes dry land and the Israelites can cross. And so it's exactly as the Bible describes. So it's a natural event, but just at the right time.
But there's another idea for a dead end that fits the hybrid approach and claims to have located all the place names specified in the Bible. Now retired, I met Dr. Fred Baltz at the church where he had pastored for over 40 years in Galena, Illinois. He's written a book on his findings called Exodus Found.
The people with their various theories all have looked at where the water is, and I realized you have to look at where the water was. Colin Humphreys thought the same thing, but I'm looking farther north than his proposal. I'm looking at Timnah, because Timnah has the sites that we're looking for based on the Exodus text.
As Dr. Baltz was investigating ancient maps, he ran across an unusual feature on one of them that revealed two bodies of water he had never seen before.
This one shows a lake here and a lake here.
Yeah, I see that.
These lakes are there only on the 1896 map because this cartographer was there in the spring.
Ah.
He was there after the spring rains when the water gathers in those two places. And I received communication from someone in Israel just recently confirming it still happens.
However, this location of Timnah is about 15 miles north of the Gulf of Aqaba and nearly 250 feet above sea level. How would this have been considered Yam Suf, the Gulf of Aqaba?
I think due to the fact that it's in the valley, the same valley that extends all the way up to the Dead Sea, the Rift Valley, I think conceptually people would have thought of these other waters just to the very north of the Gulf of Aqaba as part of the Yam Suf.
Twice I have visited this ancient site of Timnah. It was a copper mining center that was sometimes controlled by the Egyptians and later was on the border between Israel and Edom. Dr. Baltz believes this was the location for the dead-end step of the Exodus route at the sea.
We're looking down on Timnah. 3 stone outcroppings. The one to the farthest to the right is what we would call a mesa. A mesa is a projection from a lower surface with a flat top. That's one of the definitions, the dictionary definitions of Migdol.
Here, Dr. Baltz was associating the Hebrew word Migdol with a towering rock formation.
There is a stone wall, or the remains of a stone wall around the top of it. Now, the new understanding is that that wall was for the protection of the people inside, so it becomes a fortress. You have Migdol there, I would say, in spades.
On top of the Migdol, there was an ancient Semitic high place, which he suggests was connected to Baal worship, fitting Baal Zephon.
Now, if Pi Hahireth means mouth of the waters, we're in the Wadi Nehushtan, which comes down to our body of water here. We have that definition covered too.
Dr. Baltz also proposes that Mount Sinai was a volcano in Arabia, the plume of which was the pillar of cloud and fire that was leading the Israelites.
Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel.
So what you're suggesting is that the Israelites were following this band.
They had been following off in the distance this pillar. Now the pillar, driven by the east wind, that is the same east wind that will divide the waters, it's coming their way. And that would have been an ominous, frightening-looking cloud.
Dr. Baltz believes that the plume from Mount Sinai in Arabia would have been driven counterclockwise around a strong low-pressure system along the ground to the crossing site.
There's another instance of a picture from space of a volcanic plume traveling with the wind along the ground.
I see. You're saying that this plume somehow came between them.
It came across the ground because a strong east wind was driving it.
But the Bible sort of gives this impression it was the angel of the Lord.
And there again, I mean, I wouldn't deny that, but it was the Lord in the pillar of cloud that looked down upon the Egyptians. You couldn't see through it, and there's volcanic lightning in it. And it says that not one came near the other all night.
So far, I've seen 2 alternative crossing sites on the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, each involving shallow water. This leaves 2 proposed locations in the Hebrew approach, either of which would demand a deep water crossing. Some scholars reject these locations because they reject miracles. Others, like Sir Colin Humphreys, are okay with the supernatural, but believe God primarily works within the normal laws of nature that we see every day. And it would be impossible for deep water to part naturally by wind. But there's another big reason for the widespread rejection of a deep water Aqaba crossing: the personalities who have popularized the idea. It all began in 1960 with a photograph taken near Mount Ararat in Turkey of a mysterious boat-shaped object which was published in Life magazine. That drove Ron Wyatt on a lifetime pursuit in search of biblical evidence, beginning with Noah's Ark.
I believe that God has preserved time capsules in different parts of the world, mostly in the Far East or Middle East there, and that these are to get the attention of people.
Ron Wyatt was an amateur archaeologist and could be considered one of the first Exodus explorers of the 20th century, and the most controversial. He claimed to have found spectacular evidence for many biblical events, more than seemed possible for one man. In 1978, he rented a small plane and flew down the western coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, looking for a place where the Israelites could reach the sea and be trapped. He found a deep wadi, a dry valley that led to Nuevo Beach, a massive protrusion of sand out from the mountains. Wyatt later drove to the location.
We're out here at the beach that the Israelites came out on when they came out of the canyon system that they had been following by the leading of the cloud, and of course following Moses, who was following the cloud. Out of the mouth of the canyon here, totally enclosed by the sheer cliffs on either side. And having arrived at the beach, I imagine they were rather shocked to look out and see a wide expanse of sea awaiting them. From that point, they could go no further. And of course, when Pharaoh and his host came out behind them, they were quite ready to stone Moses.
It was here that Wyatt started to dive, looking for the remains of Pharaoh's chariots on the seafloor. Over time, others who learned about his search joined in the effort, including Swedish DNA research scientist Dr. Leonard Moller. I saw Moller in a film about this subject, and that's how I became aware of the Exodus investigation. I was impressed with his scientific approach.
In experimental sciences, we have a very standardized procedure to follow. You put up a hypothesis, you perform an experiment, you or others can repeat the experiment, you do statistics, you put it all together, you have a manuscript, and you publish it. That's the normal function for science. But if you go back in history, it's a totally different issue because we cannot repeat the experiment. But you can use scientific tools to investigate different parts of the history, and in that way you can apply science. So you have everything on. You have air?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have to open it.
Moller and others continued the investigation that Ron Wyatt began. Since Wyatt first proposed Nuevo Beach, it has become the most popular option for a deep-sea crossing in the Hebrew approach. So what detour would the Israelites have taken to reach a dead end at Nuevo? Before turning, Dr. Fritz believes that Moses was heading toward a Mount Sinai location in Saudi Arabia.
Now, Moses was commanded to bring the Israelites to the mountain of God. The normal route that would have been taken again would be across the peninsula, above the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, I don't think Moses was planning on having to cross a body of water to get to his destination. Now, Exodus 14:2 says that the Israelites were told to turn aside.
The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in."
They were to turn from the route that you normally would consider to be the direct way into Midian, and that they were to encamp between Migdol and the sea. And it's a place where you could either continue on to the east, as the blue route shows, or you could take a route that headed down to the only opening to the sea. And today, this opening to the sea is a place called Nuevo.
Now, the canyon that you see behind me is part of the southern route that would lead them up to Edom, or present-day Elat. This was the way Moses assumed that they would go. However, God instructed them as they actually turned northward here to go the way that would have required no sea crossing whatsoever. He told Moses to turn back, or in the opposite direction. And this, of course, led them down by the sea.
I traveled down this wadi or riverbed canyon called Wadi Watir with Moeller. The road was rough and twisting, and yet I could see it would be easy to traverse the valley floor.
The description of Moses in saying that Pharaoh thought that the Israelites were trapped or imprisoned in the wilderness definitely applies to the geography and the geomorphology here. Very rugged peaks, one route in, one route out, no way to turn once you get into that wadi.
Its steep walls are up to 7,000 feet high and lead to a mouth of a gorge.
And we also read in the Bible that Pharaoh thought that he had the Israelites imprisoned in the wilderness. And the actual Hebrew word there it means closed or shut up in the wilderness.
The first century Jewish historian Josephus wrote a description that matches the Bible well.
Now, when the Egyptians had overtaken the Hebrews, they also seized the passages by which they imagined the Hebrews might fly, shutting them up between inaccessible precipice and the sea. For there was on each side a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness, and obstructed their flight.
And so, when we think of the language of Josephus, we think that the terrain adjacent to the crossing site had to be very rough terrain, had to be mountainous, had to have limited escape routes.
In contrast, Glenn Fritz notes that the land around all the border lakes in the Egyptian view is extremely flat, with no mountains of any kind. And when Dr. Moeller and I traveled to that area, having served as an officer in the Swedish military, he posed a simple strategic question about the Egyptian army.
And when we look at the lakes here, why should the army follow the Hebrews out in the water instead of going around the lake and meet them on the other side, and in that sense trap them in the water here? From a military point of view, it would be much smarter to go around the lake and trap them.
But that wouldn't be an option at Nuevo.
Here we are approaching the beachhead at Nuevo. This is about 8 to 10 square miles in area, which would certainly accommodate the Israelites. Now, there are no other beachheads on this side of the Gulf of Aqaba that have this same sort of morphology, where you have adequate space for many people to camp and you have access to the interior of the Sinai Peninsula.
But how do the biblical place names of Exodus 14:2 fit with a crossing at Nuevo? The Egyptian approach connects the name Pi Hahiroth to the Akkadian meaning of mouth of the canals. But Glenn Fritz favors a Hebrew definition.
I believe that you have to consider the landmarks to be large and bigger than life type of landmarks. Now, Moses and the Israelites were told to encamp before or on the face of Pi Hahirot. Now in Hebrew, Pe HaHirot literally means mouth of the gorges. And as we look into this interior of the peninsula, we see that it's a series of serpentine gorges going back into the higher terrain.
In Fritz's view, the Hebrew of this verse actually puts the mouth of these gorges where the Hebrews would have entered the Wadi Watir, and that this entrance was facing north, which is what he believes the term Baal Zephon, or Lord of the North, was representing. But what about Migdal?
Migdal in Hebrew means tower, and a lot of people would say, well, that's a building or a tower. However, we have to think in grander terms in the broad open wilderness of this area, and think that perhaps Migdal represents the towering mountain mass at the base of the Sinai Peninsula. And so if they encamped at this area here, which is a broad beachhead, now Nuevo, they would be encamping between the sea and Migdal, the towering mountains.
At Nuevo, Ron Wyatt found a column on the shoreline. It was reported to authorities who later erected it. Wyatt also claimed to discover a matching column across from Nuevo in Saudi Arabia that was later removed by the Saudis.
A granite column that we first found in 1978, and if you look at the column behind me here, this part was laying down in the surf, and it had been eroded considerably by the surf. This is one of a matched pair of columns set up at the crossing site where the Habiru, led by Moses, crossed the sea. There was an inscription at one time on this, we believe, simply because there is one on a column just like this on the other side. However, it's been eroded away or chiseled away. We're not sure which. It may have been chiseled away and then toppled into the surf.
The thing that is unique about it is its design. It's Phoenician design. And the one on the eastern shore had an archaic Hebrew inscription.
Wyatt later translated the inscription from memory for the column on the Saudi side. He claimed to have identified the words Pharaoh, Mizram, Death, Edom, Yahweh, and Solomon. He believed these columns were erected by King Solomon and dedicated to Israel's God Yahweh to commemorate the miracle of the Exodus sea crossing.
When I look at that, what I see is a Roman column. It's a typical Roman column. It's nothing to do with the period of Solomon at all. Now, as for the one on the other side, on the Arabian side, well, nobody's ever seen that. It supposedly has an inscription on it mentioning Solomon, mentioning Moses, mentioning the death of somebody or other. We don't know, but we've never seen the inscription. We've never seen a photograph of it or a drawing of it, and we've never seen the actual pillar itself. So how can we make a judgment on something we've never seen? When you don't have the evidence to hand, you cannot discuss it. You've got to have that evidence.
The debate over Wyatt's discoveries did not end here. Possibly the most controversial find came in 1988.
I use some electronics that can tell you where gold is located at a distance. And so I triangulated from the shoreline. I went down and, shall we say, started moving silt and stuff until I actually found this gold veneer chariot wheel.
I contacted Dr. Gregor Hudson, a marine ecologist and coral expert. He is also the founder of Reef Check. I showed him images of Wyatt's gold veneer chariot wheel.
The suspicious thing about that particular photograph is that the wheel is extremely clean. And as we can see from the underwater footage, anything that sits on the bottom for any period of time that's got a nice flat surface to it will be encrusted with all kinds of living organisms, from squishy little sponges to hard calcareous objects, from bryozoans to corals. And so it's extremely suspicious looking to see an object like that.
Over time, the claims by Wyatt and the other Exodus explorers became widely criticized because of their inability to verify their finds as well as their amateur approach. This has caused scholars to dismiss the Gulf of Aqaba as an option for the sea crossing, too far, too deep, and too controversial with its connection to Ron Wyatt. However, Wyatt wasn't the first to suggest a sea crossing at Aqaba, or that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. A century earlier, Charles Beek, one of England's preeminent geographers, also proposed these areas. But for these radical ideas, he was stripped of his gold medal for his achievements in geography. All these Exodus explorers defended themselves by claiming they were documenting sites that no one would acknowledge had potential connection to the Bible. And in some cases, these sites were off limits, even to archaeologists. But the question remains, whoever put pillars here, whether one or two, what were they marking? Wyatt's claims divided people. Some believed he was led by God, but there were others who argued he was a fraud just out to make money. I never met Ron Wyatt. He died several years before I was involved, but I did interview people who knew him. Eric Lemke was one of them. Lemke joined the fire department right out of high school. He later joined the U.S. Forest Service as a hotshot, jumping out of helicopters to fight remote wildfires. He went on to get a degree in business at Cal Berkeley.
I always wanted to work in national security matters. I ended up getting accepted, went all the way through the process, started working for the government, national security matters, federal law enforcement.
So tell me how you got involved diving at the Red Sea.
I always had an interest in biblical stories. And I happened to meet an amateur archaeologist by the name of Ron Wyatt. I thought, I need to meet this person firsthand to verify, one, the messenger, and two, personally, if I can, evaluate whether or not they had any credibility.
I know that people have been very critical of Ron Wyatt, thinking that he's not credible.
Sure. Let's be honest. One man finding this location, as well as, quote, a lot of other locations that he's made the claim to find, I think if somebody is not skeptical to begin with, just believes it at face value, they're not doing exactly what they should do. Because what does the Bible say? It says, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. And so that's initially what I did with Ron. I thought, okay, I've got to meet him, then I've got to evaluate these things firsthand. And I found him to be consistent all the time. Now, there's certain things that he has made claims of that at this point in time, we don't know the answer to it. But I take it from the approach of, let's wait and see. And I had no reason to doubt him from what I had seen. I didn't witness some of the previous chariot wheels that were documented. I didn't see them. But I believe that he found them based upon what I just told you and my experience with him. He was a one of a kind. I'd never met anybody else like him.
I too just wanted to know if there was any proof to the things these Exodus explorers claimed to find at Nuevo Beach and how that fits into the pattern. Next, I need to investigate the southern end of the Gulf of Aqaba for its detour to a dead end. Steve Rudd is an archaeologist and researcher who runs the world's most visited website dealing with matters of biblical archaeology. He has also written the book Exodus Route Restored. He takes the Hebrew approach and favors a dead-end crossing site at the southern end of the Gulf of Aqaba, at the Straits of Tiran.
I started by using just the Bible alone. I didn't use literary sources. I didn't use archaeology. I didn't use anything. I ignored what everybody said and just sat and looked at what the Bible said. And it was then that I conceived that the crossing point must be somewhere down here, and that, of course, automatically forces Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia.
What general route do you have the Israelites taking to the sea?
So it comes down here, and I call this the Exodus Highway. It's about 18 to 20 kilometers wide. It's perfect travel for a large population. And when you cross the sea, you've got the same thing continues over here. Very, very easy travel. And so what I believe is the Israelites came down here and they came past to Etham, and they were trapped at Etham. They came to a dead end. Why? Because there's a series of mountains that go all the way over here, and it's impassable. You cannot walk through here. The water comes straight down on a sharp angle. They're really trapped hard here. God says, turn back. It means, for example, when Isaiah is calling the people to repentance, he uses the same word. Come back to the Lord, turn back to the Lord. And we know the word repentance means to change 180 degrees direction. And so it's very natural to have this mean a reversal and what I call a backtrack. Etham is one of the most critical markers for all the crossing points, of which of all the potential crossing points that I'm aware of, this one here is the only one that fits perfectly where they're genuinely trapped. But they came back and they camped here. It was at this point that Pharaoh realized this geography, that he could come down, and if he could just get to right up here at Succoth.
Get up here?
He's got them. He figures he's got them trapped. So he comes down with his 600 chariots, and they would stop right about here.
And so you're placing Migdol, Pi-hahiroth, and this area over here.
Tim, Pi-hahiroth, probably what it means is it's designating the tri-intersection of the three bodies of water that intersect at this point. Now the Migdol, if you have, the copper mines over there and the copper mines up at Timnan, you've got the Egyptian seaport, there's going to be travel through here, and it's very logical for a Migdol to be somewhere in here. We don't have any archaeology for any of these sites. There is archaeology for Migdols up on the northern coast, and people say, oh, well, there's none down here. Well, Migdols were everywhere. It just means a fort, a tower, a watchtower.
One reason Steve Rudd thinks a crossing at one of the border lakes would not fit the Bible is that after they crossed, the Israelites would still have been in close proximity to several Egyptian forts.
When they crossed the Red Sea, they felt safe. They were rejoicing. Crossing the Red Sea is, in the Bible, the time of Israelite salvation. So over here, they wouldn't start having any rejoicing because you would not feel safe. They would start running. They'd just keep running.
In the detour to a dead-end step, which one of these locations seems to fit the biblical account best? In the Egyptian approach, it's a fortress that causes the detour, which sends the Israelites to the near side of one of the marsh lakes along Egypt's border. It links place names mentioned in the Bible for the dead end, with Egyptian meanings and locations. In the hybrid approach, the detour proposals near the north end of Aqaba favor naturalistic explanations for the pillar of cloud and fire, with a volcano as its source, and the dead end occurring at shallow bodies of water. In the Hebrew approach, the detour in the central Nuevo beach proposal would have been an unexpected turn off the main way to Midian that led through a gorge to a massive beach where they were shut in on all sides by mountains. The detour at the south end of the peninsula's Straits of Tiran was caused by an impassable mountain range. So it comes down to this: which evidence is stronger, the Egyptian place names at the border lakes or the biblical descriptions of the journey found in the Hebrew approach? As I looked further into the scriptures, I saw something very revealing that might give me a clue.
People of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt?"
Egypt controlled various territories at times, but historically, the ancients defined Egypt proper as the lands watered by the Nile River. And Glenn Fritz notes that with a dead end at the Gulf of Aqaba, the Israelites would have been both outside of Egypt and in a wilderness, in line with what this verse states. However, on the near side of the border lakes, they would have still been in Egypt. I'm now ready for the fifth and final step in this phase of the investigation: deep sea, and explanations for the Egyptian and Hebrew approaches for the Red Sea miracle.
And you cast their pursuers into the depths as a stone into mighty waters.
I wanted to start with the Egyptian approach and its naturalistic explanations. How does it explain the waters parting in a shallow water scenario?
The Bible tells you it's a natural mechanism. It's explicit. The Bible says Moses spread out his hand over the Red Sea, and the Lord sent a strong east wind which blew all night. So the Bible's telling you it's a strong east wind which blew all night, which did it. And it's still a miracle because, you know, the timing. But I would explain all that by something that's called wind set down, which is well known to scientists.
While in Boulder, Colorado, I met with another scientist about this wind set-down idea. Carl Drews is a software engineer at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He wrote the book Between Migdol and the Sea, Crossing the Red Sea with Faith and Science. He has studied storm surge modeling and the wind's effect on water and land masses. He proposes the Exodus crossing happened at a lake north of Bala Lake, at a place he calls Lake Tanis, near where Lake Manzala is today. How in the world did you decide to get involved with this?
I was in graduate school my first semester, and Professor David Noon was explaining the Ekman spiral, how the wind blows across water and the water pulls back and recedes from the shoreline. And suddenly there came into my mind, I've heard this story before. I've heard this. This is about the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea. The strong east wind blew and the waters parted, and Moses and the Israelites escaped. So as everybody else was taking notes, my mind was elsewhere, daydreaming and thinking about this scenario and how this could fit.
And so the key is the east wind, isn't it, for you?
The east wind is the key. If the direction comes from any other place, then this crossing there won't work. Curiously enough, I didn't really have to know the wind direction. The only possibility for a crossing with water on both sides is really up here. Even if you try blowing the wind in all sorts of different directions, you get no set down at the Gulf of Aqaba. You really don't get water on both sides here. So still, the only possible place is here. If you had told me that somewhere near the Sinai, wind blows and splits the water, I could find it from there.
Okay, how does it work? How does wind actually move water?
I'll explain how this works by showing you an animation here. This is the results of the computer model. This is a schematic of what the area looked like. And so what we see is the Lake of Tanis here. All in the blue is bodies of water. The deep blue is the Mediterranean Ocean, and the green is low-lying land. The red is higher land on the Sinai.
So where were the Israelites?
The Israelites began on the point of this peninsula here, looking toward the east. And so we'll see what happens to these bodies of water when the wind blows. Nothing much happens at first. Then you see this brown area growing here on the east side. That's dry land. That's where the water has completely blown away from the surface of the lagoon, leaving dry land below, which is now 2 meters below the former level of the water. So it's blowing back and creating a larger and larger area of dry land there. The Egyptians are over here somewhere. The Israelites are stuck on the end of this peninsula, hoping that something good will happen out of this. The water is pulling back, and at about 9.5 hours, sure enough, there's a dry path leading forward to freedom there, which is the opposite shore. They have water on both sides, so they start heading across. Wind keeps blowing, and they have plenty of room here. So it's really not a narrow passage as you've seen in lots of these depictions. It's quite a wide area. This is probably 4 kilometers wide, so there's room enough for anybody to go through. They crossed along this land bridge here. This brown area here is dry land, and they are now safe, exhausted on this point here, but they're alive. And the chariots are meanwhile have figured out what's happening because it's now dawn. 12 hours after the wind starts blowing, the wind stops. So water now is unconstrained by the force of the wind, and so it's going to be surging in from both directions. So if they are stuck in the gap, they're going to drown.
How deep would that water have been?
Right now, the lakes here are about 2 meters, maybe 1.5 meters deep. That depth of 2 meters fits the definition of somebody drowning, especially if they can't swim very well with their armor on. It's also the present depth of these lagoons here, so there's a decent basis for thinking about 2 meters deep.
With that returning water, could it even be higher than 2 meters?
Yeah, the return surge certainly would be higher. Maybe it would be 3 meters deep, maybe even 4. When it comes back, it forms this thing called a hydraulic jump, which is basically what most people call a tidal wave. And it's this huge frothing wall of water which comes just at you, and if you're in the gap there and you've been up all night and you're trying to get yourself free, it would be terrifying to have this wall of water coming at you.
Yeah.
And there would be no escape from it.
I showed Carl Drews' wind set-down animation to David Roll, and he noticed that the Bala Lakes area went dry before Drews' Lake Tanis area.
And I've seen that the Bala Lakes area does dry up on that model, but there's a reason for that, isn't it? Something to do with the depth of the water, is that right?
Yes, the Bala Lakes dry up in the north part, and what has been postulated there is that it's a marshy area. It's not a full lake, so I have modeled that as a 0.5 meter deep, which is about 2 feet or so, whereas I have the Lake of Tanis at 2 meters deep, which is about 6 foot 7 inches. So if there's a shallower area, such as the marsh, it will dry out quicker during the wind set-down event.
But it won't be as dramatic in terms of the return of the water when a very shallow situation like that, would it?
Yes, you would get about 1 meter of water coming back over it in the return surge, which would be about waist or chest high, but that is a smaller return surge than I postulated the Lake of Tanis.
Right, but what happens if we adjust your model a little bit? Let's say, for instance, we increase the depth of the water to 1 meter. Would it still have the wind set-down effect?
A moment ago, I quoted to you a 6-hour crossing time. If the water were 1 meter deep at the Bala Lakes, perhaps the crossing time would be 4 or 3 hours. So it'd be a shorter time, but yes, it would still happen.
How might a wind set-down have looked for an Exodus sea crossing if it happened at one of the shallow bodies of water, either on Egypt's border or north of Aqaba?
Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night, without one camp coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. The waters were divided. People of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left.
One of the things that came up when I announced this research was, is this a miracle or is it not a miracle because you've shown it can happen according to the laws of physics? The shorter answer is, this is absolutely a miracle.
This event happened precisely when they were there, and I would say that that again is showing the hand of God.
The Israelites thought they were going to die when the sun went down, and in the morning they ended up alive over here, and that's a miracle.
The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and of cloud, looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily.
At the Timnah shallow water crossing site north of Aqaba, Dr. Baltz had an interesting observation related to Exodus 14:25. It states that when the Egyptians pursued, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud clogged their chariot wheels, so they had difficulty driving.
They may have pursued actually through this volcanic dust coming down on them. The little microscopic particles are very sharp. This is like new sand. and so it is notorious for destroying mechanical things. This got into these bearings and started to destroy the bearings from the inside. It cut wood shavings loose, and those wood shavings tended to fill up the void between these collars and the axle and stop it from turning. Either way, you have a disabled chariot army.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." The Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. And the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared.
This kind of shallow water crossing, however, doesn't match what I saw when I was a kid watching Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments.
Behold his mighty hand.
It was on in the evening every Easter Sunday and became a special tradition in my family that often included popcorn and sometimes root beer.
Who shall withstand the power of God?
I could see the Bible coming to life, with Pharaoh's army being drowned in the mighty Red Sea.
This is an illustration by Gustave Doré, whose grandfather copied without embarrassment.
This project allowed me to get to know C.C. DeMille, Cecil B. DeMille's granddaughter. We spent several days talking about Cecil's intensive preparation for making the Ten Commandments.
And hung up the phone.
One of the things I found very interesting about your grandfather was how much research that he put into making the films that he made.
For DeMille, research was everything. He said he made his movies at his desk. Indeed, he did.
And Josephus wrote
But he always wanted to make the story of Moses. So he never stopped researching Moses.
Between the baby and the basket.
We had so much research that Henry Nordlinger, our leading researcher, wrote a book for USC called Moses in Egypt, which at the time was the best research done.
To film the Ten Commandments, we rolled our cameras on the very ground that Moses walked. Here from the land of Goshen, across the Red Sea, down through the deserts of Shur and Sin, to Mount Sinai, the holy place of God.
What I find ironic is that DeMille's research led him to follow the Egyptian view of his day by putting the sea crossing at the shallow border lakes.
Lead them through the midst of the waters.
And yet his film depicted a grand miracle with high walls of water through a deep sea, in line with the Hebrew view of what the Bible seems to be describing. But this spectacular depiction is not how a crossing would have looked at one of the shallow marsh lakes. The challenge that I see with wind set down is that the water would be miles away. I mean, it would be pushed miles away from either end, and you wouldn't see a wall of water.
You would see a wall of water coming back at you, I suppose, you know, once the people are through and the Egyptian army is at the center of this. But
well, let's just say when Cecil B. DeMille, made his films on the Ten Commandments, he illustrated the fact that the Israelites were walking and they could see the wall of water on their left and wall of water on their right. That's the impression you get when you read Exodus.
It is, and in some ways it's the cultural impression you get from Cecil B. DeMille's movies. You've got this vision in your mind now of that's the way it should look, but it's not what the Bible says.
Well, it does say that there are walls of water.
Yes, but not deep walls of water, not high walls of water. That's the issue here.
But is the Egyptian view ignoring or downplaying important biblical passages, talking about deep waters with walls? The Hebrew approach says they are. It comes down to the definition of Yam Suf, the name Moses gave for the crossing location. This term is translated Red Sea in most modern Bibles. However, it is thought to mean Sea of Reeds by those in the Egyptian approach. But the Hebrew approach sees many reasons to look to the Gulf of Aqaba as Yam Suf, where the miraculous crossing took place. I set off for one of the largest seminaries in the United States. Duane Garrett is a Hebrew scholar who authored a commentary on Exodus.
Every biblical occurrence of Yam Suf that identifies a location puts it at the Gulf of Aqaba. There are many places where Yam Suf is used. It doesn't specifically say where it is, it just says the Yam Suf, and that's what you have in Exodus. But there are many other occurrences of the term Yam Suf that clearly put it at the Gulf of Aqaba.
Yet those in the Egyptian approach, including geographer Dr. Barry Beitzel, disagree.
The expression Yam Suf is being used to identify more than the same body of water, more than one. It did refer to the Gulf of Aqaba, but it also referred to the Gulf of Suez. It referred to inland lakes.
However, the Hebrew approach believes this view is based on circular reasoning and the false assumption that the crossing had to have happened near Egypt.
There is no reference to Yam Suf that has geographic markers attached to the term in the narrative, in the description, that put it anywhere except the Gulf of Aqaba.
But there was more to this point. In Exodus 23:31, God tells Moses to record the boundaries of the promised land. God says, "I will set your border from the Red Sea, or Yam Suf, to the Sea of the Philistines." The southern border of ancient Israel has always been known to go from Aqaba to the Mediterranean, as it does today. And if Moses is an eyewitness to the sea parting and is recording something as important as the boundary sea by the same name, wouldn't it be important to have a specific location in mind? That's why those in the Hebrew approach declare that Aqaba is the only option for a crossing that fits the biblical criteria of being both outside of Egypt and a border marker for Israel. I've actually heard from some scholars that, well, there are many Yam Sufs. And what you're suggesting is that that couldn't be the case if this is a boundary marker in the Bible.
You're right. If this had multiple definitions, it dilutes the meaning of Yam Suf. And it was given as a boundary of the Promised Land. And if it was a generic, generalized body of water at any location that you want to imagine, it wouldn't make any sense as any kind of a boundary for the Promised Land.
Another thing that troubles me about a shallow water crossing is that Moses emphasizes the depth of the sea. That's why this step is called deep sea.
And you cast their pursuers into the depths as a stone into mighty waters.
As I looked at the Song of the Sea recorded in Exodus chapter 15, Moses also mentions heaps of water that were piled up, and he calls the water the deeps in the heart of the sea. If he's writing an eyewitness account, then a shallow lake scenario doesn't seem to match these descriptions. And this wasn't the only place. The Bible has numerous references to the crossing being through deep and mighty waters. There are some verses in scriptures that says it was the great mighty deep sea in Psalms and places like that. So what are your thoughts on that?
When you look at those verses that talk about the great depths and sank like a stone, those are all in poetry. So for example, Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, and also in Psalms. So in poetry, it tends to be metaphor and symbols and kind of exaggerate things. So it's not a strict narrative there.
The thinking is that if it's poetic, it's fictional.
Right.
Or it's exaggeration.
Historical truth claims can be made in multiple genres, be they narrative or be it poetry. And we see both, evidence of both, in the scripture itself.
Well, I was thinking about the Star-Spangled Banner, which is talking about a battle. You know, oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light.
Bombs bursting in air, yes.
When you think about the Star-Spangled Banner, it's a poetic retelling of an event.
And the fact that imagery is used does not diminish in any way the veracity of the reality that it testifies to. The key is identifying that it is the exact same account and the same God that is being described in Exodus 14, narrative, as in Exodus 15, poetry. What it describes is a big God who is orchestrating the very hearts of the Egyptian rulers. He foretells, I'm going to harden their hearts so that they will go into the sea. He pushes Egypt into the sea. He carries Israel through the sea. He causes the wind to blow, the waters to crash, decimating the entire Egyptian army. All of that in the narrative. It's not just that wind shows up and that's the only miracle. In chapter 14, verse 17, God himself declares, I will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his hosts, his chariots, his horsemen. This isn't about wind getting glory. This is about God getting glory, so that everyone will know this was indeed about him.
Yet scholars in the Egyptian approach stress that because Yam Suf means sea of reeds, the crossing site requires shallow, reedy water.
To have papyrus grow, while you can have salt water or fresh water, you have to have shallow, quiet water. It has to be calm. The water has to be calm, and the water has to be shallow. So any of these lakes would fit that.
But does Suf really mean reeds, or even any kind of plant?
And was there a Hebrew word for a plant besides Suf?
Yes, there are. Yes, there's a word for plant, but that's, in a sense, almost not a relevant question because this is an Egyptian word, and we're in an Egyptian context.
The first time Suf was used in the Bible was in the passage after Moses was born. Most English translations say that Moses' mother placed him among the reeds, or the Suf of the Nile. In this passage, Dr. Beitzel believes that the Bible is using terms borrowed from the Egyptian language, and that these Egyptian words determine how to interpret the meaning of Suf.
And after 3 months, the daughter of Levi, the mother of Moses, was no longer able to hide him, so she got for him a papyrus. That word is used only twice in the whole Bible. It is an Egyptian loanword. Papyrus is not going to be a Hebrew word. She made for him a papyrus basket or chest. That's used twice here and only one other place in the whole Bible. It's an Egyptian loanword. And then it says, she took it and she placed it in the Suf, in the reeds or whatever, along the edge of the Nile. Then, we're told, the Pharaoh's daughter saw the basket or chest in the midst of the Suf, and she sent her servant girl to get it. So in the span of about 5 verses there, we have 7 different uses of Egyptian loanwords.
So what you're saying is that the Bible in those chapters is borrowing or taking, as you call them, loan words? Or
these are loan words.
And what you're suggesting is that the word Suf is not as much Hebrew as it is Egyptian.
I don't think it's Hebrew at all.
And that the word Suf means reed, right?
Yes, and it's embedded in the immediate presence of 5 other technical Egyptian words.
The Sea of Reeds for the Hebrew Yam Suf nowadays is a common translation, but I personally don't think that's accurate. It is not the translation that was preferred in the ancient world. They translated it as Red Sea, not as Sea of Reeds. They're trying to connect the route of the Exodus and the crossing of the sea to these little lakes that are on the eastern edge of the Egyptian delta, but I just don't think that's what the Bible is saying.
The question is, are the Near Egypt crossing sites just the result of Egyptology's bias in linking Bible place names to Egyptian words and locations? For example, the Egyptian place name Patufi, or place of reeds, was known to exist near the border lakes and is thought to connect to the Hebrew name Yam Suf. This focus on Egyptian words began with the birth of modern Egyptology, which in time would be incorporated into the Egyptian approach to the Exodus. It started in 1798 when Napoleon and his French army campaigned in Egypt, sparking a fascination with all things Egyptian. During that expedition, the famous Rosetta Stone was discovered. On my trip in 2002, Dr. Moeller and I stopped to film the stone at the British Museum because it was the foundation of modern Egyptology.
This is the very old Rosetta Stone that was found in the Nile Delta, 1799, by a French officer, and it was then later brought to the British Museum in 1802.
This artifact, dated at 196 BC, recorded the same message in 3 different scripts: Egyptian hieroglyphics, Egyptian Demotic, and Greek.
It took some 3 decades before they, by the use of these 2 types of hieroglyphs and the Greek, to translate the dead ancient Egyptian language. And by this stone they got a key to get a fuller understanding of all things we know of today in ancient Egypt and the history and the literature.
The Greek writing next to the 2 Egyptian scripts was how the code of the Egyptian hieroglyphs was broken, flooding the land of Egypt with scholars eager to discover the secrets of the pharaohs. These treasures of Egypt allowed it to become the dominant authority in the study of ancient history and to influence how people viewed the biblical text. Was there a more Egypt-centric view of the story because of Egyptology?
No, I would say absolutely not. That doesn't hurt. But modern Egyptology doesn't give us all of those Egyptian loanwords.
I was just thinking about the connections between certain names like Tufi and Suf.
Yeah, those are Egyptian words, those are Egyptian loanwords, but there's no argument against that.
Mm-hmm.
I know of no professionally trained Egyptologist who has taken another view. Gardner, Simpson, Grohl, Kitchen, Vietek, and Huffmeyer. To me, that's very significant.
But that's my point. These were all Egyptologists with an Egyptian approach to the Exodus. I'm just asking the question, have 2 centuries of Egyptology changed the way we see the biblical account? Because not all agree with Suf's connection to reeds. I went to Penn State University to meet with one of the world's foremost Egyptologists, Donald Redford. The Bible says that the Israelites crossed the sea. In Hebrew, it says the name was Yam Suf. What would you say Yam Suf was?
Well, there are several schools of thought about this. If you agree, and I don't, but many people do, that Suf, Yam Suf, is Chufi. It's an Egyptian word meaning reeds. The lake of reeds, or the pond of reeds, is a vast extent of low-lying land, and it borders on Pi Ramesses. But there are others who derive Suf from the word for destruction. Yam Suf, the sea of destruction.
Really?
Yeah, and there is another word, Suf, well, it's the same, from the same root, meaning the end.
The end, yeah.
Final part of the sea.
In Hebrew, we have to remember that words are in families, and the families are determined by the root verb. And for Suf, the root verb is safa, which means to consume, to destroy, or to perish, the idea of an end. And of the 101 Suf-like words in the Suf word family, 72 of the verses correspond with the idea of end.
So it would be Yam, sea, and Suf, end.
End, very simply.
In Exodus chapter 2, Moses' mother made him a papyrus or reed basket. But this is a different word than Suf. Suf was where his mother placed him.
In the original Greek Septuagint, those scholars did not give a vegetation name to Suf. They called it elos, which can be a pool or ooze. Perhaps Suf was referring to the edge, the end of the water, the edge, the shoreline. The point here is that Suf does not need to have a vegetation definition.
What I know is that the Israelites journeyed out of Egypt, crossed the desert, and were told to turn back and encamp at the sea, called Yam Suf. Was this the Sea of Reeds? Was it near Egypt? Or was it the Gulf of Aqaba?
Yam Suf was not the Sea of Reeds. It was not a weedy sea. I believe that Yam Suf meant the Sea of the End. That means the end or the boundary of the Promised Land.
A lot of energy and work has gone into translating Yam Suf. None of that matters because we have 6 Bible verses that explicitly call the Gulf of Aqaba Yam Suf. So you know what that means? I don't care how you translate it. You can call it the Sea of Reeds, you can call this the Red Sea, you can call it the Blue Sea, I don't care. This is Yam Suf.
The ocean's over there on the left. This is Ocean Drive. Well, the thing about being here at the Atlantic Ocean, it's part of the sea, and so my mind always wanders to the events of the Exodus at the Gulf of Aqaba. Yeah. You see the waves and you see the depth, and it must have been a horrific experience for the Hebrews to see that body of water in front of them with the waves and not have any idea that it could be supernaturally parted.
Yeah. How would it be possible for anyone to cross the Gulf of Aqaba on foot? Huge mountains on every side plunging straight down to the 6,000-foot deep waters of the Rift Valley itself.
I would tell you, first of all, that you're looking in the wrong spot. It's simply too deep. There is absolutely no way, barring a supernatural act, that people could have gone across there, that much water could have been moved.
Dr. Fritz explained to me how crossing at Nuevo Beach would be possible if the water was removed.
When we look at the structure of the Gulf of Aqaba, the distance between the hypothesized crossing point and the shore of Arabia is about 9.7 miles. The problem is it's about 2,800 feet deep in the middle.
Mm-hmm. And that's the big problem. I mean, people do not see this as a possibility. A lot of people just think this is ridiculous.
Oh yeah, it's an impossibility. Some investigators have said there's a land bridge in here. That's not true. There's no land bridge at 2,800 feet underwater. What there is in the midpoint is a plateau from north to south.
Because these areas here are cavernous. I mean,
yeah, you can see this dropping off steeply here and dropping off steeply here, but there's a plateau that if there was a path through the sea at this point, the path could be several miles wide and still accommodate a footing that could be managed by the multitudes.
I could see that the seafloor off Nuevo Beach was unique in all the Gulf of Aqaba. However, David Roll doesn't see any rational possibility for a deep-sea parting.
So my big problem is this business of identifying the Gulf of Aqaba as Yam Suf, simply because of its depth, and we're talking about several hundred meters of water here. How on earth could that sort of water be moved by a strong wind? And the Bible tells us it's an east wind.
Well, the question is it a physical, naturalistic event that God used nature to do it, or was the wind symbolic?
Why mention the wind if it's not the mechanism for making the dry land?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You know, and as I'm saying, I'm not in the position of having to prove the miracles.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the job of people who think you can dry a sea like that going down several hundred meters to dry land and walk across that and hold these enormous heights of water up. What could cause that? You say a miracle. Okay, well, give me the evidence that there was a miracle performed here. What evidence is there?
Others have different challenges to a crossing at places like Nuevo Beach. I met with marine biologist Dr. Robert Carter from Creation Ministries International. He has a PhD in coral reef ecology.
One of the main problems with Aqaba, I don't care how deep the water is, because this is a miracle. God can do what he wants.
but one of the main problems is the entry and the exit. The western side tends to have a more gentle slope, but the eastern side has a steeper slope. So maybe there's a place where God could have picked out a path where they get to the other side and they could, meander back and forth to climb up, but that's no easy thing. When you're talking cattle, old people, young people, babies, it'd be a very difficult trek.
John Hall, working with the Geological Survey of Israel, was the first to publish scientific data concerning the slope of the underwater plateau.
On the north and south of this plateau, the depths plunged to more than a mile, certainly meeting the biblical criterion of a deep sea. Yet the terrain from shore to shore has an average slope of less than 7 degrees. To put this in perspective, a maximum grade on an interstate highway is 6 to 7 degrees. The downslope here was 6, the upslope here was 7.4. A wheelchair ramp, 7.125 degrees.
These grades seem to be no different than the kind of terrain they would have encountered as they traveled through the wilderness. But what about the slopes at the Straits of Tiran?
Well, the depths are very forgiving here. It goes down to about 300 meters, and it comes back up to about 50 meters all the way. 80% of the route is under a relatively flat, 50 meters below the surface. And so there's this little area here of a dip, and it's very easy. I've looked at the angles and the slopes. It's no problem at all.
The Straits of Tiran are not as deep as these other places, but it's like a roller coaster ride to get through some of these 30 to 40% slopes that are encountered in the channel area, and certainly would not accommodate any wheeled vehicles like chariots.
Either route is really quite simple. The slopes of Tiran, in some places, could be a little steeper, but remember, God prepared for them to make this crossing, and He also gave them supernatural help.
As I filmed Moeller walking along the shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, I was filled with a sense of awe. If you were to pick a location to part the water, this would have been one of the most spectacular places to do it.
And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to remain silent." Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. The waters were divided. People of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the psalmist says, "When the waters saw you, O God, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world, and the earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen."
The Exodus story is a combination of miracles and history. Now, the miracles you can't deal with archaeologically or rationally because they're miracles.
I went to Washington, D.C. to talk with Herschel Shanks, the founder and editor of Biblical Archaeology Review. He is an attorney who became interested in the archaeology and the history of the Bible after visiting Israel, the land of his heritage.
Whether the Red Sea parted is a miracle. Whether the 10 plagues happened is a miracle. I mean, you have one of the plagues was darkness, and you had darkness where the Egyptians were, and right beside them in the different area was the Israelites were, and it was light there. Well, you know, that rationally that may not make sense, but miracles, you can do anything. So you have elements of miracles, and we cannot ask ourselves rationally whether they occurred.
The text describes that the water was as walls on each side of the people. And we don't know of any scientific explanation or what phenomena that would cause that. So we have no scientific explanation to the separation of water.
Dr. Moeller may be a scientist, but he's given up. He's abandoned his scientific investigation at that point, and he simply asked us to believe that if you believe in God, if you believe in the Lord, then of course the Lord is capable. But for a scientist, that's not a scientific explanation.
To many modern thinkers, the miracles are just too fantastic to believe. And then there's the God question that makes people uncomfortable. Yet this seems to me to be the central question of the whole event. Does God act in history? And if so, how? The modern prejudice against miracles goes back to the arguments put forth 300 years ago by David Hume.
And he says, well, given that there is lots and lots of testimony that seas don't part and dead people don't rise, what kind of evidence would we need to overcome that? Well, what kind of testimony? We would need very, very strong testimony. It would need to be recorded at the time by educated, thoughtful people with good character, and then it would need to be written down right away and so forth. So he says that's what you would need for a miracle, but you never get it. So basically, when people report miracle stories, the evidence isn't nearly good enough. And on top of that, we're gullible. Generally, people like to hear stories and tell them again, and people gossip and start passing stories on, and they get better and better with the telling. So miracles probably come from that.
But as I listened to Hume's requirements for believing a miracle, I could see that Moses, in fact, fulfilled all the criteria. Theologian Dr. Craig Keener confronted Hume's arguments in his 2-volume set, Miracles. If we talk about Hume for a little bit, what was the argument?
But if you had to summarize it in one part, it would be that uniform human experience is against miracles, or at least against us accepting that something is a miracle. And the problem with that argument is it becomes circular when you have testimony of miracles and you dismiss it on the basis of uniform human experience.
The question is, can science really explain everything?
In each discipline, we need to apply the standard of evidence appropriate to that discipline. For history or for journalism, you can't always experiment on something. If somebody died, you want to find out how they died, you don't kill them again. You have to recognize that the testimony of a reliable witness is itself evidence.
Philosopher of science Stephen Meyer received his PhD from Cambridge University. He's written numerous books, including The Return of the God Hypothesis.
If God exists, then miracles are entirely possible because there is a God there to act. There's no reason to think that a biblical miracle actually violates the laws of nature. If I toss this ball in the air and cause it to elevate, I'm not causing something to happen that violates the law of gravity. Ordinarily, we would expect that a ball would fall to the earth. But if I introduce a countervening force and toss the ball in the air, I've simply introduced a force in opposition to the ordinary force of gravity and therefore caused something unexpected to happen.
C.S. Lewis also disagreed with the popular view that many had taken from Hume, that miracles were irrational.
It is quite inaccurate to say that a miracle breaks the laws of nature. It doesn't. Indeed, one must believe that nature works according to regular laws before you can notice something that we are quite unaccustomed to seeing. Rule out the supernatural and you will not see miracles.
Yes, the prison that we create for ourselves is thinking that matter and what we see is all that exists.
Just because science doesn't have the explanation doesn't mean that there isn't an explanation. And a logical explanation is it was a miracle, that there is an intelligence outside this universe that helped make that happen.
If I, as an agent, can introduce an unexpected event into nature, then surely God, as the ultimate agent, who's responsible for the laws of nature themselves, is capable of introducing an event which may produce something surprising.
Professor Garrett normally takes a Hebrew approach and doesn't have a problem with spectacular miracles. But when it comes to the parting of the sea, he believes the text emphasizes the work of natural wind, which would require shallow water.
For me, the most important thing is the Bible explicitly says there was a natural cause. And the natural cause was the east wind that blew all night. And so you have to acknowledge that the Bible requires a natural cause. It was not just that the water stood up supernaturally with no physical cause.
Any wind that would have come and performed something like that had to have had some sort of divine guidance. And again, we are very uncomfortable with miracles, with anything that cannot be explained by science. If this is real, if this is true, then it's time that we get comfortable with it.
It was the wind holding the water at bay in a way that it wouldn't ordinarily do, but which it did do because of God's exercising his powers of agency, just as you and I have powers of agency and can affect unexpected changes in physical systems.
Verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and it was the Lord who drove back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. Yes, the wind was there. He was using it, and yet the text is clear. Yahweh was at work in pushing back the water.
It's interesting to see how DeMille reflected this thinking with the insights of an old man.
The wind opens the sea!
God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils.
He was the ultimate mover. He was the decisive agent. The wind was merely instrumental in his hand.
The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning, the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." And the sea returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. So the people believed in the Lord and in Moses, his servant.
According to the Bible, the sea was large enough to destroy all of Pharaoh's chariots and army. The amount of debris left behind must have been massive.
Chariots are bristling with weapons, bronze weapons, and none of that stuff floats. Spear points, arrowheads, axe heads, sword blades.
Ever since Ron White identified Nuevo Beach as a potential crossing site, divers from around the world have been searching for the remains of Pharaoh's army. Finding chariots here would be compelling evidence for a deep sea crossing.
You bring me up one chariot wheel from the bottom of the sea there, and I'd be convinced.
I traveled to Nuevo Beach with Moeller to film divers as they continued to investigate. Could there be evidence for a miracle at the bottom of the sea?
It is extremely complicated to work in these waters. This is no normal dive. The search area is massive. You are swimming in a politically explosive area with 4 very nervous countries competing for territorial control. So what do we look for? Circular shapes, 90-degree angles, strange patterns and things that seem to be piled on top of one another.
One diver described it as if there had been a massive wreckage and all these parts were scattered everywhere with all twisted shapes, things that wouldn't grow in a natural way.
Some of them are just table coral, which the divers are very aware of and dismiss out of hand.
One particular coral growth caught my eye. On approaching it, I recognized the shape as being of similar dimensions to one of the chariot cabs that we had seen in the Cairo Museum. It was heavily encrusted with coral, but I actually thought I would try out the size of the shape by kneeling in its coralized form. The coral on the object was 10 to 12 inches. More intricate work would not have been there. There were parallel struts at the front of the coral growth.
They're not allowed to take up a single coral from the sea at this location. It's illegal to do that. But the divers did find what they believe were animal and human skeletal remains. Dr. Moeller and I took these samples to Dr. Ebba During, a Swedish forensic bone expert.
When we found this, we speculated over that it's rather similar to a human femur.
I think if you compare those two, there are certain likeness, of course. So I think you have the caput here, going into the hip bone, and this you have for muscular attachment here.
Similar to this one.
To this one here. But if you follow what we call the diaphysis, like this, you can see that they are very much alike, and it is sort of a little bent. And that's very, very special for the human femur. So I think it's not a bad likeness.
But there are questions about whether any of the remains could have lasted for 3,500 years.
It's actually kind of problematic to think that anything would have lasted a long time. I mean, the bodies would have been rapidly consumed, plus bones dissolve in seawater, so even if the fish didn't get them, the bones would go away. But anything made of wood is going to decompose really rapidly.
But some people are saying that wood has lasted for a long time. Like there's a boat they found in the Sea of Galilee that was actually buried in the mud.
And that's the point. It was buried in mud. If the wood is exposed, it's going to get consumed. If it's buried in mud, especially anoxic mud, it can last a very long time. But if the wood is above the sands, it's gone.
However, if giant walls of water came crashing down on the chariots, would the seafloor have been churned up, covering many of the artifacts? Moeller suggests that the wood from the wheels disintegrated and that the coral took its shape, perhaps leaving traces of metal where it reinforced parts of the wheel.
If you were searching the seabed and searching for man-made objects, if you get a positive reading from your magnetometer, it wouldn't necessarily prove that there was a man-made object there, because there are many natural objects which could set off your magnetometer. Where we get our magnets from, of course, is from natural deposits of iron ore and magnetite, and the seabed is a place where many of these compounds do accumulate.
I think I probably dived on about 10 or 12 different trips. I understand that within coral there are traces of metal, But you can set the frequency of a metal detector so that it doesn't pick up traces of those minerals. What's really important is the pattern of metals found within coral. We've come across interesting shaped corals, and you run a metal detector around it, things don't quite add up, you'll move on, and you'll find a full circle, perfect dimensions, symmetrical. Then you'll run a metal detector across it and you'll find metal readings in just the right places, where the hub is, where the spokes would be. Too much of a coincidence for me anyway.
Two wheels stand like this, with an axle in between. Circular shape, and this,
I mean, there's no disputing things like that.
For certain it's not a coral reef.
No, it's not natural.
If you want to find a chariot wheel and it looks like a coral, you have to prove that it's not a coral, because it just looks like the way corals grow.
Yeah.
Even if a chariot wheel was lying on the bottom of the sea and it got encrusted in coral, you wouldn't expect it to maintain that shape over time, because first of all, corals grow. So if you had something that's being encrusted with coral, well, the coral's gonna keep on growing and it's gonna all of a sudden not look like a wheel anymore. There's no telling what shape it would take on.
So something that's 3,500 years old wouldn't still look like a chariot wheel. Is that what you're saying?
It shouldn't. The only way to do that would be maybe it got encrusted and then buried in sand, and then maybe recently got re-exposed again. But then you'd have to, again, you have to scientifically examine these. You have to look at each one. You have to ask good questions. You can't just jump in the water and see something round and say, oh, I see a chariot wheel. That's not the way science works.
What is necessary is a proper investigation led by trained archaeologists before any further claims can be advanced. The divers and their remote cameras haven't been able to go deeper than about 100 meters, leaving the vast majority of this area unexplored. I wonder what they might discover if they use submarines to investigate the deep caverns on either side of the plateau, where coral cannot grow. From the beginning of my involvement, I had heard about Eric Lemke finding a spoked wheel on the sea floor. His discovery came 9 years after Wyatt had found his golden wheel. I was cautious about the report of Eric's find. He too had waited over 2 decades until he found someone he felt he could trust with his story. This would be his first public retelling of the events. Explain to me what happened one day when you were diving.
Sure. That was, like I mentioned before, the spring of 1997. There were 4 of us on that trip. It was myself, Ron Wyatt, Dr. Muller, and an individual that he brought along by the name of Rory. Towards the end of the dive, we came back up, did our safety stop at 15 feet to decompress. And once we came to the surface, there was only 3 of us there. Myself, Ron, and Leonard. So I said, hey, where's Rory? And you could see his bubbles off in the distance, trailing deeper where it started to drop off. I said, listen, if one of us doesn't go back down, something's wrong, he's not gonna make it. So I submerged and I got down to about 60 to 80 feet, and my eye caught something. It was circular in nature, and you could clearly see the circumference of a round object, a rim.
Did you see any spokes?
Definitely, yeah. There was a hub in the center that was clearly visible, and it was roughly about, I would say, describe it as a grapefruit. Very smooth in nature, almost like a grapefruit cut in half, like a hub.
And had you ever seen a chariot wheel before?
Oh yes, yeah, I've seen chariot wheels in the Cairo Museum. I don't know if they're ceremonial in nature, but this one was definitely a little bit thicker. So it was like a dirty bronze color, very dark in nature. And this was the only time that I had seen anything definitive, period, that resembled an ancient wheel.
So what happened to then Rory? Is he swimming off?
Yeah, I realized at that time, you know, my air was getting low, and I'm looking off in the distance, and he's still swimming in a straight line, going out deeper. And I knew at that time that I couldn't catch him with the limited air I had left. And I literally just start motioning like this underwater. All of a sudden, he stops, he spun around, we caught our eyes. I said, look at me in the goggles, and I motioned him, come here. I pointed like this. I was right over the top of it, trying not to move. And when his eyes saw it, and he looked up, they got really big in the goggles.
I lost my octopus, my mouthpiece. I was so surprised when I saw it and so excited.
His first reaction was to go down to it and grab it, like he was trying to pull it off the bottom.
I could see clearly 5 of the 6 spokes, as well as the rim, at least 75% of it.
The silt was really stirred up.
I was trying to lift up the chariot wheel, but the problem was it was too heavy. Now I was really out of air.
He gave the dreaded, I'm out of air.
And you're 90 feet below?
Yes, approximately 95 feet below the surface. So I grabbed his vest and held onto it, and it inflated my BC, my buoyancy compensator, with as much air as I could, and literally just shot straight to the surface like a cork, without initiating a safety stop at 15 feet to decompress.
Yeah. We surfaced just a little bit too quickly, and as a result of that, there was some kind of bends that I got.
I mean, that's a very dangerous thing, but it's all you can do, right? Because you're going to run out of oil.
Well, yeah, the first reaction is, I got to get to the top. Well, we popped to the surface. My first reaction was, Ron, we've got a wheel. I'm not moving from this spot. And Ron, remember, he said, well, you may not be moving, but the current's moving you, fella. And sure enough, we were drifting.
Because some people would say, well, why in the world didn't you have a camera?
On that last dive, I wasn't carrying the camera, Ron was.
You were carrying the light.
I had the light, correct.
Searching for this evidence was one reason I traveled to Nuevo Beach with Leonard Moeller back in 2002. Yet, after all these years, no one has been able to relocate the wheel. All we have are the eyewitness accounts. Dr. Jennifer Hall Rivera is a forensic scientist. She is a specialist in fingerprint analysis and a former crime scene investigator. She is now an author and educator with Answers in Genesis. How valid is an eyewitness account?
Eyewitness accounts can be very valid, especially when we look at forensic science. We will have a lot of circumstantial evidence most of the time, very little direct evidence. So because of that, a lot of times they're relying on eyewitness testimony to help, validate all of this indirect evidence that we may have. Now, eyewitness testimony is very subjective. If they were just a bystander or were they directly affected by it, can affect someone's interpretation. But what they have found is that if someone goes through a very traumatic experience, especially when a life is involved or something violent, those accounts that they give are far more accurate because it was so important to them and it was such a stressful situation. They're going to have far more accurate memories, and that has been backed up by a lot of research. And also, as time goes on and we think about something that has happened, a lot of time our memory actually and our details actually improve with time because we can really process it as well.
Because you thought you were going to lose Rory, and you could have potentially died yourself.
Yeah, that's true.
That your memories are very vivid.
The sequence of seeing the wheel, him coming over, pointing at him, watching his eyes just get big, grabbing onto it, stirring up the silt. I'll never forget, I'm out of air sign. At that point, that part is very, very vivid.
Now, I love the fact that people are looking for these things, and I'm hoping someday we're actually going to find really good evidence for Pharaoh's army. But when I look at what's been seen so far, I'm a little skeptical. The human brain tends to lock on things that are weak arguments. We all do it all the time. Scientists do it, non-scientists do it. So we all have to be very careful to think very critically through issues. So the people who found wheels in the bottom of the Red Sea, more than likely they find a coral colony. It's not a wheel at all. Or they found something modern. Those are the first two answers for the question. If it's ancient, that's an extraordinary claim.
So what you're saying, it's not wrong to look.
We need to look, but we also need to verify. Be very careful when we draw a conclusion based on a little bit of evidence.
As a strong proponent of the site, there's so much we have from the biblical narrative that if we're trying to find a location with a well-preserved army at the bottom of the sea, and we're hoping to recreate chariot parts at every turn, I think that really does a disservice to the site and to the credibility of it.
What I find interesting is that, to my knowledge, of all the crossing locations, this is the only one where people are searching for physical evidence. It's true that so far, none of these finds have been verified as dating to the time of the Exodus, nor have they brought up anything for archaeologists to examine. But then again, none of the other crossing sites have verified remains either. Ultimately, finding chariot wheels does not determine the nature of this miracle. And it's the scale of the miracle that has fascinated me all these years.
A miracle is something that God does for us. He wants to speak to us. He wants to get our attention. So when Moses, for example, parted the Red Sea, it was something that God did to blow their minds.
In Exodus chapter 9, the Lord told Moses to go to Pharaoh and give him a message.
But for this purpose, I raised you up. Why? To show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. That's what God is doing in the Exodus. And a natural event would not have accomplished it. It needed a divine intrusion to overcome the greatest army on the planet.
So what you're saying is that God was communicating that this was a big event. This was him acting in history.
That is exactly what he says is the point of the Exodus, to make much of him. And the greater we minimize such a reality by viewing it in naturalistic terms, the more we are minimizing the very glory of God, and that's a dangerous thing to do.
It sounds good to say that it must be a sea, because I guess it might, somehow you think the miracle is a greater miracle if it occurs in the ocean or something like that. But if one takes a naturalistic view of events here and attributes those to the Lord because of the fact that it happened at the right point in time and the right point in space, means to me it was a miracle.
Do you think that it was miraculous?
Yes, but not in the sense that we think of miraculous, as in spectacular. It's not a Cecil B. DeMille miraculous. These are things we wrestle with. I wrestle with them. I'm not prepared to jump one way or the other on a lot of these things.
He could have delivered them 1,000 other less dramatic ways. He chose not to. He chose to do it in such a way that it was for maximum effect, that they would never forget it, that they would talk about it for millennia, because no one ever parts bodies of water. It never happens. It's like somebody rising from the dead. That doesn't happen. So if it does happen, you can be sure it's a miracle.
During this investigation of the Red Sea miracle, I've uncovered 6 steps for the journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai, with 2 main approaches. The Egyptian approach puts the sea crossing near Egypt and has everything happening on a smaller scale. It has about 20,000 Israelites crossing a small desert within a few days. A detour takes them to a dead end at one of the shallow marsh lakes along the border. These locales are supported by connecting place names in the biblical text to Egyptian meanings and sites, such as the Sea of Reeds for Yam Suf. Most using this approach favor naturalistic explanations for the miracles of Exodus, with a natural wind causing the parting of the waters. The miracle was in the timing. The Hebrew approach has everything happening on a much larger scale, with millions of Israelites taking many days to cross the desert of the Sinai Peninsula before turning to end up trapped between mountains and the sea at the deep waters of the Gulf of Aqaba. It maintains that the Egyptian place names don't actually fit the Bible, and instead puts more emphasis on the full biblical account and its descriptions of how and why the events happen. It notes that Aqaba is the only sea the Bible directly links to the Hebrew name Yam Suf. Many in this group interpret Suf to mean end, relating to the end or boundary of the promised land, and the end of the Egyptian army. In this approach, these waters are parted with a spectacular miracle that holds up great walls of water. This is only explainable by the direct intervention of God. There are also hybrids of these two approaches. Some put the crossing on the northern tip of Aqaba, but through shallow waters parted naturally. I know there are reasons why most people today choose the Egyptian approach, but I personally lean towards the Hebrew approach and its view of the Exodus on a grand scale, because I think it matches what the Bible is describing. Now, whether God works in spectacular ways is an important question, because it impacts how I view God and how I live my life. And as I came to discover, it's really what this film is about. But do miracles still happen today? I'm here at North Central University, where my parents met, eventually married, and a little while later I was born just over there at Swedish Hospital. Well, I too would come to North Central, and it was during that time that I began to have an interest in filmmaking. In fact, I believe that someday I would have a movie in the theaters. 40 years later, that dream came true. On January 19, 2015, my first film, Patterns of Evidence: The Exodus, was shown nationwide. I saw it with my wife Jill in New York City, at a theater in Times Square. January 19, 2015, was a big day for John Smith as well, because that was the day he drowned. He was portrayed in the 20th Century Fox feature film Breakthrough. When I heard that he was coming from Missouri to attend my old college, North Central, I decided to contact him. There were just too many connections.
I get a phone call from my mom. She calls me and she asks if I want to go to the gym that day because it's a holiday. I said, of course. I love the game of basketball, so whatever I can do to play, I'll do it. She said, I love you. I said, I love you too. 8 seconds later, all three of us fell to the ice.
Were your lungs filled with water?
When they pulled me out, I was a fountain. It was coming out of my eyes, my ears, my nose, my mouth. They rushed me to the hospital, and there I laid lifeless for over an hour. They did everything medically and physically possible they could. My mom arrived, and they rushed her in, and Dr. Kent Sutter said, you can go talk to him. And what's amazing to hear about this unique story is that two of the people in there, Alex Giddens and Keith Terry, they will vouch that when my mom walked in the room, not just the atmosphere changed, but the physical temperature in the room changed. And when she prayed, something rushed up my body so powerful that it pushed all three of them back.
Holy Spirit, I need you now. I need you now. Please, please don't take my son. Please, please bring life back into John, please.
And when she prayed that instant, I got a pulse, and everything just turned hectic. They were transporting me into a helicopter to Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in the city, to Dr. Jeremy Garrett, who is an expert in hypothermia and drowning. He said, this is uncharted territory. We've never heard of this. There is a 99% chance that he will not make it overnight, and I hope you're prepared for that. And that's what he told my mom. My mom got up in his face, and she pointed at him. She said, you do it, you do best. I hear you're the best. My God will do the rest.
John Smith was clinically dead for 1 hour and 8 minutes when his mother prayed for him. He fully recovered with no brain damage and was medically cleared after 40 days.
Today, you've got hundreds of millions of people who claim to have witnessed miracles. Nobody would say that all those were genuine miracles, but today, I don't think Hume himself would dare start with the presumption that we have no credible eyewitness evidence for miracles. He says no respectable people. We have people with doctorates, we have medical doctors, doctors of philosophy, so many people, and people actually who in our academic environment are sticking our necks out to talk about this.
To be able to demonstrate that God, from a scientific perspective, had done some kind of intervention in human life, you would have to be able to demonstrate it repeatedly under controlled conditions, and that would then convince scientists that this was something that was believable from a scientific perspective.
People today, even if they saw a miracle, some of them are saying, I wouldn't believe in it.
Yeah, and then they'll say, well, give me medical documentation. In a number of cases, we do have medical documentation. And so what happens when we give the medical documentation, some people will say, well, no, you have to have this happen all the time. If it happened all the time when you did a certain thing, we would say, well, that just fits the law of nature.
It's not a miracle anymore.
Yeah.
It's amazing in a world full of chaos, the amount of questions we get of why me and not someone else? He gave me a second chance at life. I don't deserve it. I don't. I wasn't serving the Lord when I had drowned, and it's a miracle that I'm here.
Well, you know, how do you answer a question when there are people that are praying for a miracle and they don't get one?
Yeah. Just this past weekend before you filmed me, I lost a very good friend, Nabil Qureshi. Thousands of people were praying for him. A number of people were fasting. If faith could always make something happen, Nabil would still be alive. But that's not the way it works. My wife and I have been through 7 miscarriages. My wife is from Africa. It's very important to have a child. Clearly, it doesn't always happen. It's not like you push a button and it happens. This is a relationship with God, and God still has the choice, and God knows more than we do.
I first started asking questions about miracles in 2005. I went back to the old neighborhood where I grew up as a kid, not far from where I had my first hamburger, at the White Castle. It was just across the street from the Sears department store, where my mother often took me.
Have you ever heard of the story of Moses in the Exodus?
Yes.
Do you actually think that miracles happen today?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Yes, I do. Because I had 2 twins about 6 months ago, and they were born at 23 weeks, and they're breathing right now. They shouldn't be alive.
And that's a miracle.
And that's a miracle.
Yes, I believe the Red Sea was parted supernaturally. In fact, when I was a kid, I got into an argument with another child in Sunday school, and I almost went so far as to challenge him to come down to the Mississippi River. I'd part it based on my faith. So yeah, that's definitely supernatural.
Do you actually believe there's such a thing as miracles?
Yeah.
Why?
Because with miracles there comes hope, and there's always room for hope.
In the last weeks of finishing this film, my hometown of Minneapolis erupted in riots from the tragic death of George Floyd. It happened very nearby. In fact, at the location of these interviews, the businesses were burned and destroyed. We are at a Red Sea moment in our history on many levels, where everything seems like it could be lost. And it's going to require something greater than can be solved at a natural human level, just like with the Israelites.
Part of the purpose of the Exodus is to give hope to a people in desperate need of more deliverance, because the curse, even though they're delivered from Egypt, the curse remains, and they continue to struggle with sin, and the presence of death is always at their doorstep. If God overcame the greatest enemy, will He not also do everything else we need? This is why the prophets are able to use the Exodus as a pattern for a greater Exodus. They'll talk about a second Exodus that is to come, and they associate that second Exodus with the Messiah.
There are times in all of our lives when we face a Red Sea moment and we need a miracle. I just want to believe they can still happen today. I want to have the faith to pray, believing that God hears me and is able. Even if I don't get the answer I expect, I don't want to stop asking. Because some of these problems will only be solved with a miracle from God. The last step of this pattern is destination. It's where Moses brought the Israelites back to worship God and receive the 10 Commandments.
If they cross here, they will leave Egypt on this side and they will enter into the land of Midian, which is called Majan today in Arabic. And they aimed for a specific mountain, Mount Sinai, where Moses spent 40 years.
So somewhere in that region is the mountain.
Yes, somewhere among these ridges, you should look for the highest mountain.
Was Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula or further east in the ancient land of Midian? This is my next challenge.